Okay, can y'all hear me? Let's do a sound check real quick. There we go. Can you guys hear me just fine? Loud and clear. All right, that's what I'm looking for. Okay, so here we are, almost done with Operation Gladio for now, at least this book of it. Um, Lots of things going on. Um, crazy stuff. So we're going to get right into the book. We've done enough of these where everybody understands kind of the lead in, and everybody's Wheaties is going to get peed on at some point in the overall exposure. And it's just amazing to me how once we understand Operation Gladio, just how often it comes up in conversation and people don't even know it. So, I want to give you a couple of examples of that at the end, but let's go ahead and we're going to get started right away with chapter 23. And at this point, Pope John Paul II, that we've talked about throughout this series, and remember that he's the Pope from Poland. He was using part of the laundered money into the Vatican through Operation Gladio to pay solidarity to fight against the Soviets. And he used that as his justification for not doing anything about it. During his tenure, multiple people were exposed as being part of the Mason Lodge labeled as P2. And the he basically did nothing about it, even though it violated canon law that you're not allowed to be a Mason. It lists some of the people, like his Secretary of State, who remained, Casseroli, who remained the Secretary of State in the Vatican until his death. He was on the list. It was exposed at least 3 different times during the course of this book in different investigations. Paletti was a cardinal. He was the president of the Preservation of Faith and an academy there at the Vatican. His name was on the list. Another guy that was listed as protector of the Church of St. Peter's in chains. And then it lists a whole bunch of different other clerics that were part of Gelli's Lodge, which is the P2. He was the and it goes from the treasurer at Vatican City, a bishop in Greece, a bishop in Ferme, and just another one that's another person in the Secretary of State, several cardinals, several friars, and even there's one that's listed in here in Bulgaria, and we know Bulgaria had a big role, even though supposedly it was part of the Soviet Union, in Operation Gladio as well. And interestingly enough, the very last one is a guy that was in charge of the school that is where the little girl Emanuela, or Londi, was kidnapped from. She was eventually murdered. And the guy that was basically a protocol officer at that school as part of the Vatican was on the list of Masons as well. So the author makes a point to call it Vatican Inc., as like incorporated, as opposed to it being a church affiliated entity, because it spent quite a bit of its time involved in money laundering. The people involved in it were not there as part of church business, especially the Masons. They were setting up front companies as part of the money laundering. They were trying to gain control over banks in Italy that they wanted to control. They owned massive amounts of real estate. This guy calls it Vatican Inc. He talks about the John Paul II's relationship with the Sicilian mafia as part of the drug smuggling. All of that was left intact. And it acted more as a financial and political institution as opposed to a religious institution. The primary goal of this institution was not the request and dissemination of spiritual truths in an age of uncertainty, but the perpetuation of its own corporate interest through intrigue, theft, and when the situation demanded bloodshed. Because we've went through murder after murder after murder, involved in trying to keep the operational aspects of this under wraps, along with Operation Gladio. During his visit to Sicily, John Paul II visited the memory of Friar Pugliese, an ardent opponent of the mafia who was gunned down and killed in front of his parish. The Pope also condemned organized crime while he's in bed with it. But the Pope's words rang hollow because of all of the transactions that the Vatican officiated between the Sicilian crime families, and all of the drug dealers. And says 21 members of the Sicilian mafia were arrested in Palermo for conducting an elaborate online banking scam with the cooperation of the Vatican Bank. Antonio Orlando, a mafia capo who masterminded the operation, succeeded in siphoning off about $115 million from banks throughout Europe during the scam. And all of it was channeled through numbered accounts at the Vatican Bank. Just before the arrest, Orlando and his crew had set in motion a plan that would basically gain them $1 billion from the Bank of Sicily. The scheme showed how dangerous the mob had become through using the internet for illicit purposes. Despite the arrest and subsequent convictions, investigators were prevented from probing into the Vatican Bank because of its sovereign status. It's kind of like you can't know anything about the CIA because of national security. After the Ambrosiano scandal, where they released all of the Masons' names and everything, things got back to normal at the Vatican Bank. They were still laundering money. And they were still doing it as part of the whole drug operation. So John Paul II's reign also had other scandals. One involved a guy by the name of Martin Frankel, and it was an attempt to take $1 billion in secured assets from insurance companies throughout the United States. After the Frankel affair came to light, the insurance commissioner of Mississippi, Tennessee, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Arkansas filed a federal lawsuit against the Vatican under the RICO Act, claiming that the Holy See had been involved in a criminal conspiracy to steal frozen assets of 9 insurance companies. The lawsuit claimed damages in excess of $600 million. Pope John II reassured the members of the Catholic Church that the Vatican was a sovereign state and immune from such litigation. Ignore them, he said. It will go away. We haven't lost any money yet, have we? And so it came to pass 20 years after the Ambrosiano affair that the Roman Catholic Church was presented in U.S. court as a criminal organization using the RICO Act, the same act that had been drafted to take down organized crime, to include the Italian mafia, who they were in business with, in America. The alliance between organized crime, the CIA, the Vatican, had set a course that the church could not alter without admitting their guilt. And it led to heroin addictions, counterfeit securities, the strategy of tension, false flag attacks that killed thousands of people, gangland slayings of judges, prosecutors, journalists, financial destitution for thousands of families throughout Italy, at the very least. It also led to moral and spiritual bankruptcy within the church. By the time John Paul II's death in 2005, the Roman Church membership in the United States had went at the astonishing rate of 400,000 a year, despite the influx, was falling at the rate of 400,000 a year, despite the influx of Catholics from Mexico and Latin America. They're talking about an open border at that point. It's not unknown that a lot of the countries in South America and Mexico has a lot of Catholics in it. And so basically what they're saying is they're importing as many as they can through an open border, and they still couldn't keep the Catholic Church full. It said that it was losing 4 for every 1 new person that walked in the door. In Spain, 81% of the people that had identified themselves as Catholic, but 2/3 never went to Mass. In Italy, by 1996, 95% of the populace identified as Catholic, but less than 25% of them ever made an appearance at a Sunday Mass. So, from a spiritual standpoint and a religious standpoint, the Vatican Bank is like going over a cliff, but it doesn't seem to matter. In Britain, the cardinal that was head of the Catholic Church in England and Wales is quoted as saying that Britain has become a pagan country, and vandalism, theft, drug dealing, arson, pagan rites like Satanism, and inappropriate behavior on the high altar has become so commonplace throughout the UK that churches had to keep their doors locked, except for the hours of worship, and use closed circuit TV cameras. So basically, the world's falling apart in a handbasket, and the Vatican Church is busy doing money laundering. Throughout Europe, the church had lost more than 1.5 million members since the close of Vatican II. U.S. bishops had received complaints that approximately 6,000 priests, and we're going to talk about pedophilia for just a minute, because we're talking about the whole spiritual decline of the church. 5.6% of the country's Catholic clerics had sexually abused children. Over 3,000 civil and criminal lawsuits were pending. 525 priests were behind bars. The cost of the scandal exceeded $3 billion, forcing 8 dioceses to seek bankruptcy. 10% of the Roman Catholic priests in America had been accused of pedophilia. 10%. Oh. They were talking about using RICO guidelines to be able to go after the criminality. It goes on to say that the pedophilia problem was not confined to America. It was in Ireland, Canada, the UK, Latin America, Belgium, France, Germany, and Australia. Oh gosh, that's where they have Gladio units at too. Increasing the cost to $10 billion and creating financial havoc in dioceses and parishes throughout the world. And instead of addressing it, John Paul II just kept rotating them around. It was as if the practice was condoned because no one was ever held accountable. Also, John Paul II's spokesman is quoted as saying, "It has to do with the reflection of our highly sexualized society." Hello? But if the priests are sexualizing the people in their church, who's to fault? Priests also are affected by the general situation. They may be especially vulnerable or susceptible although the percentage of abuse cases is no higher than in other occupations. I can damn well guarantee you that there's no single other than maybe drag queens that has a higher percentage of pedophilia. I mean, they just said it was between 5 and 10%. That's crazy. Um, John Paul II's refusal to demand the dismissals of the priests of people who had been found guilty of child molestation was likened by some people of Pope Pius XII's silence during the Nazi Holocaust, or Pope Francis's silence during Argentina's genocide, where he turned in fellow Catholic officials. The greatest shame was giving sanctuary to Cardinal Bernard Francis Law, a horrendous enabler of child abuse who resigned in disgrace from the Archdiocese in Boston in 2002. Another unforgivable act was the Pope's stubborn and self-righteous defense of a Mexican priest who had serially abused adolescent seminarians, some as young as 12, and several of his own illegitimate children. I hadn't even heard about that one. That's disgusting. Largely because of the pedophilia scandal, by 2005, the Holy See had begun to dispatch deficits in excess of $12 million. However, they knew that the real worldly riches of the church was safe and secure in the Vatican because of the Vatican Bank. The diocese may be sued and fall into bankruptcy. Parochial schools, universities, hospital may be strapped with million-dollar settlements, but the accounts of the Vatican Bank remained out of reach of the altar boys and those that were sexually molested by the priests because they were housed in a a sovereign state that was not subject to any foreign court. It remains an institution that had well over $50 billion in security, gold, and exceeded those of some industrialized nations. Real estate holdings all over the world. They own businesses. Such wealth will remain and grow even though the contributions to the Catholic Church has been cut to a trickle. John Paul II is the miracle of John Paul II is that he remained remarkably immune from criticism and condemnation. The world's leading investigative reporters and news commentators refused to take him to task, not even to question his judgment in allowing money changers to remain in the Holy Temple. It was almost as if he was immune. And it goes on to talk about a book that was written about Pope John Paul II. It was called His Holiness. It was written by Carl Bernstein. And throughout the book, none of the stuff that was actually known in a negative light about the Pope was even talked about. They never mentioned Sedona, Galli. They were never mentioned about the Ambrosiano affair or the Sicilian connection to the mafia. Never talked about the Archbishop Marcinicus being indicted or all of the issues with the Vatican Bank. So, obviously, we know the whole book deals, that whole thing and writing of books in general is a CIA op. And so obviously Carl Bernstein, who's proven himself over and over again to be a CIA asset, is the one that was picked to write that book so that when you read about Pope John Paul II, the negative things aren't going to be what you see. So one Italian newspaper depicted the Pope as the solidarity Atlas holding the world on his shoulders. Before the end of January 2006, the Vatican had reported over 2 million letters testifying to the virtuous life of the Polish Pope. Since the Vatican Bank remained a magnet for notoriety, the Cardinal Ratzinger, who ascended to the papal throne as Benedict XVI, pledged to initiate a new era of compliance with international finance regulations. By 2012, he had dismissed the current Vatican Bank's presidents, Tedeschi. Tedeschi had become the target of a criminal investigation by Italian officials for his alleged role in money laundering of millions of euros from an unknown source at JP Morgan Chase Bank in Frankfurt, and also from an Italian bank. But the real cause of the firing, according to informed sources, was neither Tedeschi's ties to organized crime nor his involvement in the bank fraud, but rather his release of papal documents, all highly damaging to Ratzinger, to the Italian press. The firing did not go as planned. Following Tedeschi's dismissal, informed Italian investigators that he had compiled an exhaustive dossier of compromising information about the Vatican that had never seen the light of day because he feared for his life. The banker had given copies of the documents to his closest companions and told them, if I'm killed, the reason for my death is in here. I've seen things in the Vatican that would frighten anyone. When the investigators seized the dossier, Pope Benedict demanded the documents be returned to the Holy See. They complied, since all Italian judicial authorities are obliged to respect the sovereign state of the Vatican. You just can't make that shit up. That's ridiculous. The ill-advised attempt to suppress the growing scandal, Pope Benedict agreed to submit the records of the bank transaction to a place called Moneyval. It's Money, V-A-L, all one word. The Council of Europe's anti-money laundering agency. The records, as expected, were doctored and incomplete. Moneyval announced in January 2012 that the bank had failed the transparency test in 8 of the 16. Yeah, you got a 50% on that test. So 8 of the 16 key categories they failed in. Full disclosure would have raised embarrassing questions. Why the church obtained controlling interest in companies that sharply convicted with its dogma. Number one, a biochemical center that specialized in stem cell research is something that the Vatican had bought. A munitions company that provided ongoing shipments to Omar Gaddafi in Libya. So they're in the arms business too. The Vatican Bank. They had also, we know, been laundering money for the Sicilian mafia, the Turkish mafia, to facilitate the illegal narcotics. A prominent mafia don was buried in the cathedral with the popes and cardinals, and they could never answer why that was. Why had the Vatican Bank sold counterfeit securities and established shell companies to build thousands of people out of their hard-earned money? How had the bank profited from the Croatian death camps and the Nazi rat lines? Because remember, at the very beginning of the book, we talked about that they had facilitated for money the covering and putting them in clerical costumes, robes, and basically creating an underground railroad for Nazis to get out of Germany. They also gave them safe haven if they were being chased to stay into cathedrals while there were active manhunts going on for them. So Pope Benedict, who, keep in mind, he just got in, he's leading these financial reforms, and he resigns as Pope shortly. Let's see, his financial reform May of 2012, and by February of 2013, he's out. At least he didn't die. So Pope Francis now, by March 13th, he's good to go. In the meantime, Islam has replaced the Catholic Church as the world's leading religion. Um, the spiritual devastation caused by John Paul II has spread to every corner of the globe. Parishes were being boarded up, convents closed, parochial schools were being consolidated in major cities. Um, as we talked about before, the mass attendance is way down. It would take a spiritual Hercules to clean out the stable of the Vatican, but we already know that Pope Francis isn't going to do that because we've already talked about his performance in Argentina. The cardinals and archbishops who were sheltered in the pedophile pre-scandal by moving them around were neither defrocked or condemned by the new Pope Francis or by Benedict. The Vatican Bank was not closed, and there was nothing done to any of the people, or nothing changed. It remained open for new money laundering scandals, and they did have some after that. At the end of 2013, Moneyvale uncovered 105 transactions within the Vatican Bank that they identified as money laundering. The apparent criminality from 2012, when only half a dozen of they had only spotted the year before a half a dozen, and by the first year that the new pope is in, they were up to 105 questionable transactions. So in April, Pope Francis presided over the canonization of Pope John II. And keep in mind that this process had been completely changed, and it was changed by John Paul II. He had cleared his own way to be canonized. They waived the waiting period after the time that he died. That was number one. But the other major part was, evidently there was a process called the devil's advocate, where is that what they called that? That seems weird. Oh, it is. Devil's advocate. So where they would have someone almost like a defender and a prosecutor, where they would actually talk about the negative aspects of some of the things that he did it, and whether he deserved to be canonized. Well, John Paul II actually eliminated the devil's advocate role. So there was only good people there to tell him how wonderful he was. And then, of course, he was canonized. So that is the last chapter. There is an epilogue, and I do want to talk a little bit about that, because what it begins to talk about is almost like a phase 2 of Gladio, where it basically folds into the war on terror, the mad scramble for the control of Central Asia, false flag attacks against Saddam Hussein, Omar Gaddafi, the rise of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and the Mexican cartels. None of that is by coincidence. Every bit of it is part of the Operation Gladio. It's creating chaos. It's creating organizations that perpetuate the chaos control terrorism that has been used for all of the preceding decades, going back to the middle 40s. Who decides which countries are to fall under the sword of the gladiators in the international arena? The answer resides in the Cecil John Rhodes and his creation of a secret society that was known as the Rhodes Society of the Elect. But they're not elected. He uses the word synarchy, like anarchy, but SYN, synarchy, like a synthesized anarchy combination, which is basically chaos. It was a collection of the most influential men in Victorian England, and this is back in the 1800s, by the way, who could chart the course of world affairs. The select group included Lord Nathan Rothschild, the head of the Rothschild and Sons, who had complete control of the Bank of England, um, a Lord Reginald Brett, which was Queen Victoria's closest advisor, Lord Archibald Primrose, who was also Rothschild's son-in-law. So he basically married a Rothschild daughter, who would serve as Britain's prime minister in the future in the late 1800s. Arthur Balfour, and keep in mind, he also was a British prime minister in the early 1900s, and he's the one that wrote the letter to Rothschild, giving them Israel as payment for financing World War I and World War II. And that's going to be important when we wrap up. Albert Lord Grey, a prominent member of the British Parliament, William Palmer, Alfred Milner, who was the Undersecretary of Finance in Egypt. In his memoirs, William Stead, the most famous journalist in England and a founding member of the Society of the Elect, writes that the secret organization was structured as a series of circles within circles. So, you know how you do those overlapping circles? So, what you have is all of these secret societies that, whether it's the Club of Rome, the CFR, the Round Table, all of them, they overlap membership. And it's the same thing with the foundations, whether it's Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, all of those things overlap so that you have this secret society that their meetings and the Bilderbergs, that's how they plan all of this stuff, is they go to these meetings with each other. And some of the organizations meet like multiple times a month. And all of this coordination is part of that. Quoting from the book, and this is a quote from William Stead. The talk concentrated presently upon the secret society, the Society of the Elect, Rhodes like that word, who were to bind themselves to work for the British Empire in a way in which the Jesuits worked for the Church of Rome. I telegraphed for Brett, who came 2 hours later, and we had a long talk, the net upshot of which was the ideal arrangement would be, as far as we could see at present, Rhodes, general of the society, Stead, Brett, Milner, to be the junta of three. After Rhodes, Stead to be general, with a third who might be a Rothschild in succession. Behind them, Manning, Booth, Little Johnson, Albert Grey, Arthur Balfour, to constitute a circle of initiates. The most powerful member of the Rhodes Society was Lord Rothschild. He established close relations with other Jewish banking families, including the Cohens, Warburgs, Schiffs, Coons, Loebs, Lazards, Lehman, and Goldmans. These families worked together, shared resources, intermarried. I mean, they were all married to each other. Natty Rothschild married the oldest daughter of Levi Cohen, a prominent London banker. Adam Schiff, who had lived with the Rothschilds, moved to America and married a daughter of Solomon Loeb, the head of the Kuhn Loeb banking family. The two daughters of Marcus Goldman married the sons of Samuel Sachs of Goldman Sachs. Paul Warburg left Hamburg for New York, where he married Nina Loeb, another daughter of Solomon Loeb. All united by blood, marriage, and ethnicity, they provided the funding to American businessmen and industrialists, including Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan. After instigating the Second Boer War to secure the natural resources of South America, The Society of the Elect spawned the Round Table movement, which gave rise to the Pilgrim Society in London. The primary purpose of this society was to forge an alliance with their American cousins and to secure the unity of English-speaking race. It was in accordance with the final directives of Cecil Rose. Among the original pilgrims in London was Lord Rothschild, Alfred Milner, Lord Rosebery, Robert Brand of Lazarus Bank, Waldorf Astor, and Alfred Biet, which is a Rhodes business partner, Jan Smuts, a legal advisor to Rose, and a future Prime Minister of South Africa, and Lord Nathan Rothschild. So, what's interesting about this is if you go back and you read anything about the Second Boer War, um, this is basically these people who believe that everyone in Africa is only there to serve them. They literally think they are worse. They viewed Africa as a labor camp for Europe. Those are almost their exact words. So they went into, and we know that for a long time, many of the countries, it's almost like they divvied them up among themselves in Europe to have all of Africa colonized. And we also know that South Africa was one of their colonies. When these people decided that gold had been discovered in an area of South Africa, and it was not an English colony at the time. They had been defeated in the First Boer War, and the second time, there were other settlers there, but they were working hand in hand and respectful of the indigenous people in South Africa. And they were teaching them farming, and it was kind of more of like a very peaceful collective thing going on. Well, once they discovered there was gold there, these men would do nothing short of killing every single one of them to get it. In the Second Boer War, that's exactly what they did. At some point, the group that had already been there working with the people in a shared kind of cropper way had told them that they would give up. They just wanted to live peacefully there, and they basically killed them. So these are ruthless animals planning our future. In 1903, at the bidding of the Rothschilds and Milner, Morgan established an American chapter of the Pilgrim Society at the Waldorf Astoria in New York. The New York chapter included Elijah Root, Thomas Lamont, Percy Rockefeller, Ogden Mills Reed, Otto Kahn, Andrew Mellon, W.B. Whitney, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Vincent Astor, Mortimer Schiff, Frank Vanderlip, Henry Davison, Charles Norton, Nelson Aldrich, Joseph Carrot, Nicholas Butler, and Paul Warburg. Root, who had become instrumental not only in the work of Carnegie and Rockefeller Foundations, but also in the creation of the League of Nations and the Council of Foreign Relations. The fact that the Pilgrims were controlled by the Rothschild money cartel was verified by the presence of Warburg. Warburg represented the German aspect of it as well, aligned to the House of Rothschild, both there and in London, and now in New York. He's the one that married Nina Loeb. And the founders of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, a financial firm tightly connected to the Rothschilds. So they created like this dining club, if you will, that by 1910, the exact same Pilgrim Society is the ones that met down at Jekyll Island to create the Federal Reserve. So you can see as you read through this, the forethought in the 1800s of exactly how they were going to accomplish everything that they wanted to accomplish. New World Order, using Africa as a labor camp, and basically taking over and infiltrating all of the governments using banking systems and central banks. The Fed was privately owned by representatives of the world's leading banking consortia: Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschild, Warburg, Kuhn and Loeb. And in the book that G. Edward Griffin talks about, The Creature from Jekyll Island, which if you've never read that book, it'll blow your mind. They, the banking families, were, this is a quote from him, they, the banking families, were often competitors, and there is little doubt that there was considerable distrust between them and skillful maneuvering for favored positions in any agreement. But they were driven together by an overriding desire to fight their common enemy. The enemy was competition. They definitely, that's another reason why I came up with the word international syndicate. They wanted monopoly power on everything. And when the legislation got passed that did away with monopolies in the United States, the way they got around it was basically capturing every aspect of the business transaction. So they created labor unions and then bought the labor leaders. They created trade associations and bought the trade association leadership. And obviously now they own the companies. So they basically have the monopoly. It's just in disguise. It's almost like you have Gladio units in the capitalist system via labor unions and trade associations. So they still control everything. And if they need something to blow up, like a strike or a labor union or whatever, it's all manipulated. Every aspect of it. They control every aspect of it. These banking families represented a classic cartel. A cartel is a group of independent businesses that join together to coordinate the production, pricing, and marketing of their members. In the case of the Federal Reserve, these elite families became joint shareholders who worked together to manipulate the U.S. and world economy. They possess the ability to create depressions and prosperity. They print money out of nowhere. They lend it to government at an interest rate. And in order for the interest to be repaid, the government is compelled to borrow more money. So the banking cartel, under the leadership of the House of Morgan, manipulated events, including sinking of the Lusitania, which brought America into World War I. We already know they're responsible for bringing us into World War II, for the purpose of creating a global government. When this failed during World War I, the cartel set up a Royal Institute of International Affairs, the Chatham House in London, and the Council of Foreign Relations in New York. In time, the Council of Foreign Relations began to preside over the affairs of the State Department. So just so you know, and I'm sure all of you do, the government sets up these nonprofits that, like Media Matters or whatever they are, the CFR, my mind's blank right now, but the Heritage Foundation. So you have some that are Republican think tanks and you have some that are Democrat think tanks, but all they basically are is a government in exile. So when they would pretend that we've elected a Democrat president, all of the people from these think tanks move over to the government payroll. When they pretend that we elect a Republican, all of these people that were in these government positions, they just move over here to the think tank, and all these people that are in the right think tanks, they move into the government. They never leave DC. It's literally rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. So you've got the people that are in this ballroom, the people are in this ballroom, and the people at the helm. So they're always together and at the helm. It's just a matter of whether they're wearing this team's jersey or this team's jersey. That's why no matter what happens, nothing happens. Nothing good happens. The CFR was established in 1919, which was 6 years after the Federal Reserve, which was established in 1913. And basically, it was to promote an international agenda on behalf of the money cartel and to make sure we have forever wars. Because what happened right after 1913? We had World War I, then we had World War II, then we had the Korean War, then we had the Vietnam War. And it was just one war after another war after another war. And then we had all of the garbage in South America. And then we had the war on terror, the war on drugs, all of them making money. This is designed to direct America's foreign policy. John W. Davis, the first president of the organization, was one of J.P. Morgan's private attorneys. Paul Cravath, the vice president, headed the law firm that protected Morgan's business interest. Russell Leffingwell, who became the first chairman of the CFR, was one of Morgan's banking business partners. So basically, Morgan is the CFR. Edwin Gay was president of the New York Post. The New York Post was owned by Morgan. Hamilton Fish Armstrong, another employee of the Post, became the editor of Foreign Affairs, which was their monthly publication. And Elihu Root, another of Morgan's private attorneys, was named honorary president. So basically, it was an organization that J.P. Morgan put together, put a label on it called the CFR, and we're in control. So the founding fathers, many of the Fed founding fathers also possessed strong ties to the Carnegie and Rockefeller foundations. So they were located in a property known as the Pratt House. John Foster Dulles, who eventually becomes the State Department guy, another Morgan lawyer, was the board chairman of Carnegie Foundation for International Peace. His wife, Janet Pomeroy Avery, was the first cousin to John D. Rockefeller, who owned Standard Oil, and was one of Dulles's most important clients. John Foster Dulles, Secretary of State under President Dwight D. Eisenhower. Another founder was Paul Warburg, who served as the chairman of the International Acceptance Bank. And if y'all were with me through Anthony Sutton's book reviews that I did on True Social, the International Acceptance Bank was one of the money laundering entities they used to pay for the whole Bolshevik housing of Trotsky in the U.S. and money going over there to pay for GE electrifying all of the Soviet Union and all of their international business in the Soviet Union, setting it up. Because basically they conduct these wars to then go in and industrialize the countries using their technology so that they basically own the company at the end of the deal, and they make billions of dollars doing that. If in the later years where there was industry already created, like we learned in the Brazil instance, they basically go in and take over all, because once they have the coup under Gladio and they get a dictator in, then they pay the dictator off and basically cause the central bank in the country to make the economy go down. Then they can pay pennies on the dollars for all of these businesses and consolidate them all. And, you know, Brazil ended up with maybe 7 privately owned large companies of people that actually lived in Brazil. The rest were all bought up by these guys. So that's why they do it. I mean, the CIA is basically their private military. They use them under Operation Gladio to go in and destroy these countries, and they buy up all the resources and the businesses, and the world goes on. So, oh, and let me, when you have a major war like we did in World War I and World War II, they get all the contracts to rebuild. So there's that aspect of it too, because I don't know if y'all know that there was a $4 billion contract let for the reconstruction in Iraq for housing, and Biden's brother had never built anything in his life. He opened a construction company, and then like the next day got this $4 billion contract. That was a long time ago. The CFR was an agency of the Blue Bloods. For the most part, its members came from wealthy old line families, elite Ivy League institutions. They joined exclusive fraternities like the Skull and Bones, Wall Street lawyers, corporate executives, bank officials, high ranking officials. Upon their arrival to their chosen profession, they would get an invitation to join the CFR, and they accepted, since entry into that organization meant that you were going to be a mover or shaker. They formed alliances, shaped partnerships, became lobbyists, political action committees, and then used the political contributions to basically buy whoever they wanted. The CFR became the first organization to unite private interests under the House of Morgan and Rockefeller with the purpose of impacting government decisions. Andrew Gavin Marshall, a research associate at the Center for Research and Globalization, writes, quote, "The CFR, established 6 years after the Federal Reserve was created, worked to promote an international agenda on behalf of the international banking elite. It was to alter America's conceptualization of its place within the world, from being an isolationist industrial nation to an engine of empire working for international banking and corporate American interest. When the Fed took control of money and debt, the CFR took control of the ideological foundations of such an empire, encompassing the corporate banking, political, foreign policy, military, media, and academic elite in the nation into a generally cohesive overall worldview," unquote. They created a monster. That's my Reader's Digest version of that. It was verified in the CFR's own publication called Foreign Affairs. Here's a quote. The most influential, Time Magazine is saying that it's the most influential periodical in print. In its inaugural issue in September 1922, this is the quote: "The dubious doctrines expressed by such phrases of safety first and America first So he's saying that America first doctrine is dubious, meaning it's not good. In the second issue, Philip Kerr, a member, and I just thought it was hilarious that they actually in 1922 denounced America first. I'm willing to bet Trump knows this. Just saying. Obviously, this is another quote. Obviously, there is going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. And he's talking about the world, not America. Equally obvious, there is going to be no steady progress in civilization or self-government among the more backwards people until some kind of international system is created, which will put an end to the diplomatic struggles of every nation to make itself secure. The real problem today is that of world government." That's the whole mission of the CFR. One world government. Like the Society of the Elect and the Pilgrim Society, the CFR was a clandestine organization. Its meeting which came to over 120 a year meetings, were held in secrecy under the rule of non-attribution. Everything was off the record. This rule was essential to ensure candor, they said. A former member decried it as scandalous and said, why should businessmen be briefed on information not available to the general public, especially since it can give them financial advantageous. It can be financially advantageous. And there's a lot of members of Congress that are in the CFR. Dianne Feinstein was. Although it was established by the House of Morgan, the CFR eventually came under the control of the House of Rockefeller. They're all in bed together. They're intermarried. It's not like that's a difference. The Rockefeller family formed the American financial establishments or was in partnership with Harriman, Brown and Company, which included George Herbert Walker and Prescott Bush, the Lehman Brothers, Goldman Sachs, which managed to push Kuhn, Loeb, and Company into the background. So you have these other people that, as time goes on, step into the forefront. Rockefeller's successful takeover of the Morgan flagship commercial bank, Chase National Bank of New York, is what thrust Rockefeller a little ahead of Morgan. After the 1929 crash, Winthrop Aldrich, son of Senator Nelson Aldrich and brother-in-law of John D. Rockefeller Jr., engineered a merger between Rockefeller-controlled Equitable Trust Company and Chase Bank. By 1932, managing to oust the Morgan's Chase CEO Albert Wiggins from office and to take his place as the head of the gigantic financial firm. Thanks to the ouster, Chase had remained the financial headquarters of the House of Rockefeller. So under Rockefeller's control, the CFR emerged as the most powerful private organization in the country. The fact that every Secretary of State, from Edwards Stennegus Jr. in 1944 to John Kerry in 2017, had come from the CFR's rank and file. Like I told you, they all are rearranging the decks on the Titanic. They're all in the same orbits. It was called the establishment's unofficial club. A sort of presidium for the part of the establishment that guides our destiny as a nation. Richard Harwood, managing editor of the Washington Post, writes, CFR members are the nearest thing we have to a ruling establishment in the U.S., unquote. Harwood would go on to identify CFR members in top positions as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, Post, and national news networks. They're all part of it. They do not merely analyze and interpret foreign policy for the United States, they make it. The CFR was a structure as if circles, just like what we talked about with the Society of the Elect. It's circles within circles within circles. At the onset of World War II, the CFR established study groups to produce reports on specific foreign policy topics, basically how-to manuals. Admiral Chester Ward, another former CFR member, quote, once the ruling members of the CFR had decided that the U.S. government would adopt a particular policy, the very substantial research facilities of the CFR were put to work to develop arguments, intellectual and emotional, to support the new policy, and to confound and discredit intellectually and politically any opposition, unquote. So this is the broiler, if you will, for the engine of one world government. The council, studies generated from the council aided in the establishment of the United Nations, the World Bank, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. Financing for the study groups comes from Rockefeller, Carnegie, and the Ford Foundations, which are governed by boards of directors that are interconnected. The board members of the Rockefeller Foundation often are trustees of the Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford Foundations. So they're all on one big roller coaster. The CFR president, John W. Davis, served as the trustee for the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations while running for president in a campaign heavily funded by Kuhn, Loeb and Company, the bank in which Paul Warburg, the founder of the Federal Reserve, was a partner. In 1960, many of the trustees of the Americans' three leading foundations were the executives of Bechtel Construction, which is one of the, like $1 trillion defense contractors, government contractors in general, construction. Chase Manhattan, Kimberly Clark, Monsanto Chemical, and other leading international businesses and banking firms. 12 of the 15 Rockefeller Foundation trustees, 10 of the 15 Ford Foundation trustees, and 10 of the 14 Carnegie were all members of the CFR. Corporate plans for expansion into new regions of the world were established by the American leading CEOs, many of which were on the boards of these major foundations. The foundations would fund CFR studies that inevitably would uphold the soundness of the expansion plans of whatever the company's agenda was. The study groups, thanks to the reports, the study groups, the interest of America became synonymous with the interest of the Rockefellers and the bankers. So it's all just the whole strategy of tension, pushing everybody. They write the agenda. This is like they're writing the script. This is the script. This is where we're going to go. This is what we're going to do because it makes money for me. And we're just going to drag y'all along, kicking and screaming. And if you take a stand and there's some resistance in the company that I want, we're going to mow you down. David Rockefeller played a key role in the creation of the Bilderberg Group, another one of these. It was actually created in 1954 under the name of Prince Bernhard, which is the Netherlands. But David Rockefeller was really kind of the engine behind it. From the beginning, the gatherings were extremely exclusive, with secrecy demanded. Its original 73 participants were introduced to talking points on the agenda, and they were asked to lead the group discussions, including David Rockefeller. Over the years, the Bilderberg Group has hosted discussions that resulted in the establishment of the EU, the Euro, the 1973 oil crisis. Yeah, Bilderberg. The timetable for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and the course of Gladio 2. Concerned by the lack of Japanese in the meeting, David Rockefeller formed the Trilateral Commission in 1973, which basically allowed, those people over there in, because you can't have them in this group over here. David Rockefeller also served as the first chairman of the Trilateral Commission. During Operation Condor, and keep in mind, Operation Condor is Operation Gladio just for South America. He traveled throughout South America, telling all the newly installed dictators, because of the coups from the CIA on their behalf, how to run their governments. His visit south of the border became crystallized in Chile, where in 1976, the military regime under Pinochet, which we talked about exclusively, ignored international condemnation and the congressional cutoffs. So Congress cut off aid to Pinochet because he's a dictator. But Rockefeller made sure he got $927 million in loans from Chase Manhattan, Citibank, Morgan Guaranty Trust, and other U.S. banks. The Trilateral Commission, in effect, had made the U.S. bankers a higher authority than the elected representatives of America. From the bowels of the CFR came the CIA. In 1946, General Vogt Vandenberg, as director of the Director of Central Intelligence, the DCI, recruited Allen Dulles, a lawyer from the House of Morgan and the president of the CFR, to draft proposals for the shape and organization that was to become the CIA. The meeting took place in the offices of the Rockefeller Center. The CIA was officially established by President Truman. David Rockefeller assumed control of the inner core of the CFR, and the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations allotted $34 million to the CIA for covert activities. Let that sink in. Dulles promptly formed an advisory group of Wall Street investment bankers and lawyers who were prominent CFR officials. In 1948, Truman appointed Dulles to chair the committee to review the CIA's performance, and Dulles again appointed 2 New York lawyers from the CFR to assist him. It's like the chicken, or the fox in the chicken house. Nelson Rockefeller served in the OSS under the command of Wild Bill Donovan, who we talked about at the very beginning. And in 1945, Nelson participated with Donovan in the creation of the World Commerce Corporation. The World Commerce Corporation was a front for the OSS and CIA. That's basically what it did. It helped provide U.S. weapons and munitions to foreign underworld groups, including Xiang, the guy that was in China, and Italian mafia. In exchange for the arms, those organizations would provide opium that helped fund the CIA. Registered in Panama, this company employed mob figures Sonny Vicerolas, notorious drug dealer, to provide services to General Xiang. John McCloy, who you remember was the guy that was in charge of the aftermath of World War II as basically like the German governor for a while, and was involved in the transfer of the werewolf units to the control of Dulles in the aftermath of World War II. Another director of this shell company was intrinsically tied to the Rockefeller family, McCloy. McCloy had been the director of Rockefeller's law firm, Milbank, Tweed, Hadley, and McCloy. The Rockefeller Bank, Chase Manhattan, and was a member of the CFR. Other members of prominent banking families that served as WCC directors included Charles Hambros of Hambros Bank, Sidney Weinberg of Goldman Sachs, Richard Mellon of the Mellon Bank, Lester Armour of City National Bank, a Chicago firm that later merged with JP Morgan. The WCC became instrumental in the CIA by providing funds to the Sicilian bandit Salvatore Giuliano to conduct the May Day massacre in Italy, which killed 11 supporters of the Italian Communist Party and wounded 57. Nelson Rockefeller's relationship with Donovan and the WCC is telling. It testifies to his complicity in the heroin trade, his ties to organized crime, and his involvement in covert activities linked to Gladio. Throughout the years, the Rockefeller families and John Dulles and Alan Dulles had been close partners in America's Game of Thrones. So John Foster was chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation, while the Rockefeller brothers, David and Nelson, supported the Dulles-favored political candidates. It's just an incestuous pool. When Alan Dulles emerged as the CIA director in 1953, the Rockefellers became the private bank of the new intelligence empire. David became an important source of off-the-books cash to the spy agency. Thomas Braden served as the head of the CIA's International Organization Division. I often briefed David semi-officially and with Alan's permission. David was of the same mind as us and very approving of everything that we were doing. Sometimes David would give me money to do things which weren't in the budget. He gave me a lot of money for causes in France, unquote. Now, keep in mind that there is substantial evidence that the killers of JFK came from France. And we have Alan Dulles, who will be fired by JFK, talking about he did a lot of stuff in France. The CFR would come to include not only the leading military industrial firms, but also many major businesses and banks in the country: Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, Chevron, Exxon, JP Morgan, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, Shell, American Express, Barclay, Lockheed Martin, Lazard, Soros Fund Management, Prudential, IBM, General Electric, Facebook, FedEx, Rothschild, North America, Northrop Grumman, Microsoft, Raytheon, Merck, Standard & Poor, Sony, Warner Media, and Walmart. That's just a small sampling of companies on the 2015 membership roster. And then it lists a whole bunch of names like Warren Christopher, Dick Cheney, Jimmy Carter, Sid Blumenthal, John Bolton, blah, blah, blah. And you go down here, Teresa Hines, Kerry and John Kerry and Joe Kennedy III, Janet Napolitano, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice. I'm not even naming them all. I mean, just go on and Joe Scarborough, Susan Rice, George Soros, Jonathan Soros, Diane Sawyer. I mean, Barbara Walters, Paul Wolfowitz, and Janet Yellen, all in the CFR bed. And you can see it's both parties. So it doesn't matter who you elect. Whoever they select is going to get put in there until Donald Trump. As a private banker for the CIA, the Rockefeller brothers allegedly played a strategic role in laundering the CIA's drug money through the Vatican Bank and the parochial banks in Italy. The Rockefellers became tied to Michele Sedona through Paribus International, which is a company where they were principal shareholders in Paribus, which was the firm that Sedona used to liquidate leading Vatican assets. So he's now tying all of what we thought was the old establishment in creating the Federal Reserve and all of the old money, if you will. He's drawing the direct correlation to how they funded Gladio. They were literally at every. So you have to understand that I say this, and I mean this with all my heart. The CIA is so prior to the CIA, when you had only to use the mafias and their apparatus, because that was always breaking the law. They were always at risk of being exposed. And throughout World War I and World War II, they really fused the two of them together because the Navy intelligence used the longshoremen, the truck drivers, and Teamsters to forge a connection so that they were basically controlling everything. So now you have this entity that is operating, and we're going to throw drugs into the mix, which is illegal. We have to figure out a way to stick this entire ball of worms, snakes, into the government so I can slap this national security label on it and never get it exposed to the light of day. Because you know that we had people that if you just stay outside of the government and you don't have that national security classification, you're exposed to being arrested. You're exposed to being put in jail. And that's what happened to Sedona and all of these people. So if I can take that same thing and I can stick it under the government and I can slap a national security label on it, We have taken the dregs of society, the mafia, criminality syndicate, which is how I came up, because this is all stuff that I've been reading about for a long time. The international syndicate that was out here and exposed, we moved under the federal government by creating the CIA. So now they have a license to do this forever. And every single time we've learned chapter by chapter by chapter, the very first thing they say when somebody asks about their involvement is, I can't tell you because it compromises national security. So they have figured out through all of their roundtables and brainstorming the perfect way to go throughout the world. Anybody that opposes them, we're going to kill. We're going to use Gladio units to do it. We're going to pay for it with drugs. We're going to use the drugs to kill people that we think are the least desirable among us. Because, they're weak. They're drug addicts. They don't care. It would be like them if you lived on a cattle ranch and you had the ones that were the pain in the butt all the time, that required the most care, if you will, and never wanted to go in the chute right. You're always having to go out and get them, use the lasso, whatever. Way too much work. We'll just kill them. That's literally what they think of people. They're cattle. We're just kill them. So, so the ties between the Rockefellers and Sedona might be easily dismissed, save for the fact that David Rockefeller was allegedly instrumental in Sedona's acquisition of Franklin National. Animosity, and we went over this a little bit already in one of the chapters where we talk about the guy by the name of Arthur Roth, who was the CEO of Franklin National, and he wanted to open a branch in New York, and the Rockefellers wouldn't let him, and he got mad. And so basically, they basically bankrupt Franklin National so that Sedona could buy it. That's that in a nutshell. MK Ultra. Throughout the 1950s, the Rockefeller Foundation provided funding for MK Ultra. We already know what it is. And it was used to figure out how drugs affected interrogations and weakening individuals, and were you able to force confessions out of them? The operation was officially sanctioned in 1953. It was halted in 1973. MK Ultra used numerous methods to manipulate people's mental states and brain functions, to include LSD, which was brought in through the CIA. They used other chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, and psychological torture in an effort, at least in one area, to try to create a Manchurian candidate. And what's interesting about this, think about the timing. Everybody says Obama is the Manchurian candidate. They started this experiment in 1953. He was born in 1961. Just saying. They also wanted someone, whether it was another Manchurian candidate, to eliminate Castro. So they're just basically experimenting on people we know. They wanted to be able to control the thoughts of Americans by using PR advertisement, hypnosis, and other forms of suggestions. So there's a tie in there financially with Rockefeller and the CFR organization funding that. Oil and bananas. David Rockefeller also began initiating CIA covert activities to feather his own nest, including a coup in Iran to oust the democratically elected government of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. In 1928, the Rockefeller Standard Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company had formed a powerful oil cartel. The Iranian prime minister nationalized Iran's oil production, breaking the oil cartel. This caused Rockefeller to lose control of a vast oil reserve at the basin of the Caspian Sea. So basically, you have a duly elected prime minister taking back their own resources from this international syndicate. In 1953, Allen Dulles began to transfer millions in black funds to Iranian General Zahedi. The funds were to be used in any way that could bring about the fall of the prime minister. The coup leaders and this is part of Operation Gladio, Zahedi planted anti-prime minister propaganda in the Iranian press, mounted demonstrations, bribed officials. Next, they staged terror attacks, Gladio, and blamed the prime minister. They machine gunned down civilians, bombed mosques, all blaming the prime minister, and had pamphlets delivered saying the people that were doing these bombings were in favor of the prime minister and communism and hated Allah. This is the CIA doing this. Following the coup, the prime minister was tossed in prison and Shah Pahlavi was restored to power. The Rockefellers gained control back of the Iran oil production. 1 year later, under Allen Dulles' direction, the CIA launched another coup of a democratically elected government for the Rockefellers. It was Arbenz, who was the president of Guatemala in 1950. He had been a progressive leader and introduced minimum wage, policy of universal suffrage. He had aimed at redistributing the country's farm acreage back to the people in land reform in 1952. The program entailed the expropriation of vast holdings of United Fruit Company, which is a CIA front company, which owned 42% of the entire country and never paid $1 in tax. Who's that sound like? Every rich person in America. So they had went into a corrupt government, bought up 42% of the land in Guatemala. Sound like George Soros here? Bill Gates? Anybody? This is exactly what they're doing here. They've done it over and over and over again. So this guy gets elected and he starts undoing all of that. And by the way, they owned 42% of the entire country and never paid a penny in taxes. The company, which operated as a state within a state, also owned the country's telephone company and the telegraph company. What did I tell you? They go in and they buy up all of the stuff. They owned all of the railroads in Guatemala. United Fruit's legal counsel had been John Foster Douglas. The Dulles brothers were principal shareholders in the firm. This is crazy. So to remove Arbenz from office, the CIA employed Tommy the Corcoran, which we've learned about before, who had assisted Helliwell in the creation of the cargo air transport, which is the precursor. I heard somebody had put that in there, Air America. So Air America, before it was Air America, was called cargo air transport. Y'all are so smart. You're always ahead. A fleet of surplus aircraft that transported weapons to the Chiangkai in China was used as part of this. A smear campaign was launched in which Arbenz was depicted as an agent of the Soviet Union, those bad communists, and who conducted a bloody purge of opponents and was a thief and raided the treasury of the impoverished country, which is exactly what they did. They're in bed with the communists. They raided the treasury by not paying a single penny of taxes, accused the other guy of it, and out on his butt he'll go. A rebel force of mercenaries launched a series of violent attacks against the Arbenz government. The attacks included invasion of Guatemala City that were supported by CIA bombing campaigns. In 1954, Arbenz was expelled from office, the CIA replaced him with a series of right-wing dictators who had bloodthirsty policies and killed over 100,000 people in Guatemala. And then what happens? They go in, the bloodthirsty dictators, they start killing 100,000 people. People run. And where do they run? They run to the United States. Strategy of tension. The entire thing is planned. Other covert activities, overthrowing of Goulart in Brazil, Salvador Allende in Chile, and that was that Pinochet guy that took his place, which was a evil bastard. He killed tons of people. So first, the Rockefellers' holdings were threatened by a popular and democratically elected official who attempted to nationalize the foreign-owned country. It's the same series. So if anybody tries to do America first policies, whether it's in America, as we saw with Trump, or around the world, it's happened time and time and time again. The CIA just goes and takes them out. And so what happened here? Trump does his America first for 4 years, and you get 51 CIA agents that sign a letter basically trying to screw him. And that's in addition to everything else they did. So we know they were behind so much. Over the course of the latter half of the 20th century, the relationship between the CIA and the Rockefellers became so close that highly classified documents were stored inside a vault in a carriage house at Nelson Rockefeller's residence in New York. Have you ever heard that before? Is that crazy? Jim, what's today? Hold on, I'm going to clean this up for just a second. I don't know who's posting this crap about banned videos. We're not doing that. So I'm going to mute you. I don't want you in the chat here messing all of this crap up. Just stop that. Okay, onward. The Rockefeller War. The Rockefeller family became deeply involved in the drug trade with the Nugent Hand Bank, which you remember is the bank in Australia where Nugent ends up dead in a car and Hand disappears. Hand definitely was part of the CIA. And it was used to purchase weapons and money launder in Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Brazil, and white Rhodesian government of Ian Smith, and to import heroin into Australia from the Golden Triangle of Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar, which at the time was Burma. The primary shareholder of the Nugent Bank was an Australian and Pacific Holding Company. The company was owned and operated by Rockefeller Chase Manhattan Bank. So everything that we've learned in this book is somehow tied to all of these people. The heroin flowing into the United States at Andrews Air Force Bank, they used, I guess, the military credit union at the bank as part of their money laundering operation. So how the BCCI, remember, that's the bank that was set up for money laundering in Pakistan. After the fall of Saigon, the CIA established the Bank of Commerce and Credit, BCCI, in Karachi, Pakistan. It was a money laundering drug operation for the Golden Crescent in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran. The BCCI mushroomed into the vast criminal enterprise with 400 branches in 78 countries, including First America Bank in D.C., the National Bank of Georgia, and the Independence Bank in Encino, California. So it money laundered arms traffic, the sale of French-made fighter jets to Chile, blah, blah, blah. We already talked about all of that. It was tied to um, Osama bin Laden used it as a bank. Saddam Hussein used it as a bank. Now, keep in mind, because the CIA set this up, they're going to be able to track all the money laundering that these dictators are doing, and use that against them. The enormity of the bank's operation was evidenced by its transfer of $4 billion of covert aid to Iraq in the Iraq-Iran war in 85 to 89. Um, the Vatican Bank was tied into BCCI. Henry Kissinger sat on the um, Italian bank that was tied into the BCCI. And Brent Scrowkoff, who became Bush Sr.'s national security advisor, was tied into that board, and so was David Rockefeller. Thanks to the CIA, heroin production in Afghanistan rose 400 tons. And we talked about this. I posted some of those statistics of how much the opium production went up. And this also ties into the cash from the drug flowed into CIA-controlled banks, including the BCCI, to America's most prestigious financial institution, including Citibank, in which Rockefellers held a controlling interest. So they get it coming and going. But all this came to a screeching halt in January 2000 when the Mullah Omar, this is about the statistics that I posted about when Mullah Omar became the leader of the Taliban and announced in January 2000 that he was getting rid of the opium poppy harvest. And so it plummeted, which of course everybody had a fit, because you're not allowed to be Afghanistan first, America first, or Chile first, or Guatemala first, or anything like that. So the House of Rockefeller, which had been instrumental in bringing the Taliban to power in 1996 through the Union Oil Company of California, Unocal, the Rockefellers had arranged to provide the group with weapons and military instructors. This aid had enabled the Taliban to capture Kabul and oust the Afghan president, Rabbani, from office. And keep in mind, another coup, the Taliban would provide assistance in the creation of a massive pipeline that would run from the oil wells of Turkmenistan through the mountains of Afghanistan to the port city of Karachi, Pakistan, on the Arabian Sea. This could not take place without a dominant central government, which, of course, Afghanistan's never had, that could suppress the tribal warlords. The shipping capacity was to be 1 million barrels a day. The problem was seizing control of the vast wealth of the oil and natural gas that surrounded the landlocked Caspian Sea. So Unocal planned through its subsidiary Sink Gas to build another pipeline, this one for natural gas, that could flow along the same route through Afghanistan. So it was very important that they gain control of the republics in Central Asia. Now, remember yesterday we were talking about the importance of Turkey in all of the stands to do this pan-Turkey initiative to get control of all of those loose apples. And this is why. It's so they can exploit them for their own profit. So this is Brzezinski's, his comment was, the world's energy consumption is bound to vastly increase over the next 2 to 3 decades. Estimates of the U.S. Department of Energy anticipate the world demand will rise more than 50% from 93 to 2015, with most significant increase in consumption occurring in the Far East. The momentum of Asia economic development is already generating massive pressures for the exploration and exploitation of new sources of energy in Central Asia region and the Caspian Sea basin are known to contain reserves of natural gas, oil that dwarf those of Kuwait, the Gulf of Mexico, or the North Sea. All about them screwing everybody else and taking their resources. And keep in mind, this is very important because we also know that that same area that's energy rich goes as far over into China, which was Turkestan, a made up country with the guy living in Virginia that's supposedly the displaced leader of it. And this all has to do with the whole, all of it. So the Soviet Union had discovered the vast Caspian Sea oil fields in the late 70s and attempted to take control of Afghanistan to do basically the same thing, to have a pipeline so the Soviets could get down through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean. So the control of the oil and gas through the monopoly of the pipelines was basically the contentious issue. So the leaders of these countries in Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan were able to see through the Russians' monopolistic ploy and began to consult with Western oil executives, including Condoleezza Rice, who used to work at Chevron. Rice was a prominent CFR member and later became George W. Bush's national security advisor. Gladio II, under the direction of Standard Oil and the House of Rockefeller, now planned to thrust further along the 40th parallel of the Balkans through South Asian republics of the former Soviet Union. The U.S. military had already set up a permanent operation base in Uzbekistan. This so-called anti-terrorist strategy was designed to consolidate control over the Middle East, South Asian oil, and contain neutralized former Soviet Union. Realizing it was in the weaker position, Russia joined the Shanghai Co-op Organization, SCO, which included China, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan. Its membership in the SCO represented Russia's attempt to maintain its traditional hegemony in Central Asia. The stakes in this chess game became sky high. Once they conquered Kabul, the leaders of the Taliban were whisked off to a U.S. military transport to Houston, Texas, where they were wined and dined. And Henry Kissinger and Richard Armitage, who both would end up in as consultants to Bush Jr., met with these guys and basically was trying to negotiate with them. Despite such power players, a final agreement was not reached because the Taliban was being pursued by other oil interests, including representatives of the SCO. Meanwhile, the tentative U.S. ties to the Taliban was offset by Moscow's support for the Northern Alliance, which is the group in the northern part of Afghanistan. Pressure was applied to Mullah Omar, the leader of the Taliban, to come to a decision on the Unocal offer. And while this is going on, you have in 1998 the Americans realizing that they need to set up a more pliable government in Kabul, in Afghanistan, because the Taliban isn't wanting to play ball with them and they're cutting off their opium production. And so plans were made to launch a terror attack against America that could be blamed on bin Laden and a host of Islamic militants to basically as applause, a way to invade Afghanistan, including on August 7th, the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania are bombed. Now, the timing of this, again, this is 1998. This is 3 years before 9/11. They're already building up the terror of the Middle East by bombing our embassies. So Then, of course, we know about the cruise missiles and the fake pharmaceutical plant. Um, so, following the attacks, Clinton addresses America and basically says, our mission was clear, basically to attack these people, and it's all bin Laden's fault. Clinton announcement was of vital importance to the shadow government. It identified first Osama bin Laden as the enemy, and second, the Taliban. Keep in mind, the Taliban had just cut off their opium supply. So you had to demonize both of those people. The new attacks were in the works, and the weapons of mass destruction were in production to be used against them. The problem was that none of it was true. Bin Laden and his Muslim pals were not involved in those attacks. They were in the CIA, was well aware, safe and sound in a madras in Pakistan. Although the missiles struck the camps, the only casualties, oh, this is a separate attack, was on local farmers. And the Sudan pharmaceutical plant that was bombed was not making nerve gas. It was making over-the-counter drugs like ibuprofen. So the attack on the embassies was conducted not by al-Qaeda, but was a false flag operation so that it could be blamed on bin Laden to make him an enemy. A key indicator of this contention was the involvement of Ali, A-L-I, Mohammed, also known as Mohammed the American, in the bombing. Following the attack, he was labeled as the point man who had masterminded the operation. 2 years after the bombing, Mohammed was taken into custody by American authorities, and he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to murder. It then came to light that the alleged al-Qaeda bomber had an outstanding U.S. military service record. He had been trained at Fort Bragg, and he had worked as an instructor in explosives at John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center until 1989. The official government narrative claimed that Mohammed, who was married to an American citizen and who had lived in California, was all the while working as a double agent of al-Qaeda, and that he had become bloodthirsty jihadi by the time the embassy was attacked in 1998. This story was circulated in the American media. One report in San Francisco in 2001 conveyed the sense of treachery and treason as, quote, bin Laden's man in Silicon Valley. Mohammed the American orchestrated the terrorist attacks while living in a quiet suburban life in Santa Clara, unquote. In reality, throughout the 1990s, Mohammed had been working for the U.S. Secret Service in East Africa, including Kenya. There is no way that the U.S. intelligence handlers did not know of every move that Mohammed was making at the time. A reporter who had spent decades investigating the 98 bombings quoted, "This guy was recruited by the CIA in Cairo, where he was a major in the Egyptian army. He was then hand-picked graduate from Fort Bragg's American Special Forces, and he went on to instruct Green Berets and PSYOPs and explosives at JFK School of Warfare. He was talking about the strictest security clearances in the U.S. military, and yet the official account expects the public to believe that somehow Mohammed's connections to bin Laden's al-Qaeda slipped their attention and that he carried out the U.S. bombings in a rogue fashion for the supposed enemy." Once you know the details, it's so laughably ridiculous. Despite pleading guilty in a New York court in 2000 to conspiracy to murder American citizens, Mohammed had never been sentenced to confinement. There are no records of his ensuing court proceedings. No one knows where he's at. To this day, his California wife, Linda Sanchez, was quoted in 2006 as saying, "He can't talk to anybody. Nobody can get to him. They have Ali pretty secret. It's like he just kind of vanished into thin air." Boom. Just like Hand of the Hand Bank vanished into thin air because they're working for the CIA. In August 1998, the merger of AMCO and BP produced the world's largest oil company. The House of Rockefeller was now united with the House of Rothschild. Holy crap. The US and Britain became intrinsically bound both economically and politically. This is in 98. The joint military industrial interests of such defense contractors such as Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamic, Boeing, and Raytheon, all part of the joint ventures. Britain's new Labour government under Prime Minister Tony Blair then became America's unconditional ally. The primary concern of the new power elite was to build the Trans-African pipeline and the threat to the world's economy posed by the Taliban's ban on poppy production. They realized that their clandestine meetings, that these problems could only be solved by invading and occupying Afghanistan and the removal of the Taliban from power. Now you have the real reason for 9/11. The first step, he outlines 3 steps towards endless war. The first one is the bombing of the 2 African embassies and making the Taliban, Al Qaeda, and bin Laden the enemy. 2 was legitimizing an invasion of Afghanistan with the appointment of Hamid Karzai as the head of the interim government. Karzai had acted as a consultant and lobbyist for UNICAL in its negotiations with the Taliban and the CIA covert operator who had funneled U.S. aid to Mullah Omar and his band of radical Muslim students. So basically, Karzai's on their payroll. So he's going to get appointed the interim government that they need there to be able to facilitate the pipeline, because he's not going to give them any problems. And step 3 was the 9/11. 9/11 started the war without end and was part of what this guy is describing as Gladio 2. In 2003, President Bush and his CFR cabinet proclaimed that Saddam Hussein was now in the league with Al Qaeda, planning an attack on American soil, blah, 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 9/11. And all of this stuff was repeated in over 532 separate occasions by this handful of people. They just kept saying it over and over. And he gives several examples of that, them saying, Saddam Hussein's the enemy, Saddam Hussein's the enemy, Saddam Hussein's the enemy, weapons of mass destruction. It's like psychological brainwashing. The problem was none of it was true. There was no weapons of mass destruction. And we all know what happened to him. I don't know if y'all know that the woman that was the ambassador to Iraq, April Gillespie, and we talked about that a long time ago, at the very beginning when the Desert Storm 1 happened, that that whole thing was setting up Saddam Hussein as well. And so now you have basically the same thing that happened again. The war was launched to create a strategy of tensions within Iraq. This allowed the Anglo-American big oil companies under the control of the Rothschild-Rockefeller cartel to seize Iraqi oil fields and further their control of the world's supply of energy. Immediately after Bush announced mission accomplished, Exxon Mobil, Chevron, Shell, and BP set up shop in Iraq, along with Halliburton. To further the plans for the construction of a natural gas line that would run from the North Pars, an Iranian port city on the Persian Gulf, to Damascus in Syria via Iraq. So now this is pipeline number 2. Most European countries remain dependent on Russia, and they're going to try to destroy Russia. I mean, this is back in the early 2000s. So Russia's on the kill list. So we're going to try to create pipelines all around Russia to isolate Russia and destroy their economy by destroying their energy production. The pipeline would serve to cripple Russia's economically while furthering the interest of the Rockefellers and the Rothschilds. Plans for this conquest and operation of Iraq had been in the works for several years. In Winning Modern Wars, General Wesley Clark writes, meeting the Pentagon officials shortly after 9/11, who said the military campaign included the invasion of 7 countries: Iraq, Syria, Libya, Iran, Somalia, and Sudan. And I also mentioned when this came up before that I happened to be sitting having lunch around this time frame. It was after 9/11. I was stationed at CENTCOM, and several of my friends worked in the J2 Intel, and I was sitting at the table with them. And of course, at the time, I was a personnel officer, so I worked in the J1. So they think they're talking over my head. I don't ever correct them. And they listed 4 that they were working on assessments for General Franks to send to Washington. And the 4 that they mentioned was Iraq, Syria, Somalia, and Libya. So Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Somalia. Evidently, there was 2 more, Iran and Sudan. So those must have been other people's, but the people that I was sitting at the table with specifically listed them as the countries they were doing assessments on, under the guise, and this is what they said, that they were involved in terror. So they have these, we were majors. They have these intel officers that are doing assessments on what their capabilities are, what their political military setup is, blah, blah, blah. In-depth assessments on and what type of threat based on terrorism capabilities, what had happened in there, were they sponsoring outside their countries, turmoil, whatever. So there's a standard template for intel assessments, but they were tasked to do this under the guise that these guys are generating terror, when in fact that's not what any of it was for. It was a strategy of tensions. Libya represented a multi-trillion-dollar trophy for big oil and the money cartel. The oil reserves were twice that of the U.S., and we've got a shitload. The conquest of Libya would prevent China from extending its economic hold over the area, and the China National Petroleum Corporation employing 30,000 workers to increase Libya oil and natural gas production. So basically, you have China. They were trying to work with someone other than the United States because we're a pariah, and that was not going to be allowed. In 2011, when the Islamic extremists took up arms against the government of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, the U.S. national news, in tandem with the CFR administration of Barack Obama, immediately started saying that he was a bad guy, that he'd mass murdered men, women, and children, blah, blah, blah. Justifying the bombing, Hillary Clinton says, "We had a murderous dictator threatening to massacre large numbers of Libyan people. We had our closest allies in Europe burning up the phone, begging us to do something." Now, the irony of that, of course, is that it is America, CIA, and operators throughout the other intel agencies all around the world that has murdered men, women, and children. It was not Muammar Gaddafi. So, March 2011, Gaddafi announced to the rebels in Benghazi, "Throw away your weapons, exactly like your brothers. They laid down their arms and they are safe. We never pursued them at all." Subsequent investigations revealed that when Gaddafi's regime forces retook that area in 2011, they did not attack or kill any innocent civilians. he actually attempted to appease protesters in Benghazi with an offer of development aid before finally deploying troops in an attempt to end the rebellion. What's more, Amnesty International investigation in June of 2011 could not corroborate any allegations of mass human rights violations. Rather, it uncovered evidence that the rebels in Benghazi made false claims and manufactured evidence. Western media coverage has from the onset presented a very one-sided view of the events, portraying the protest movements as entirely peaceful and repeatedly suggesting that the regime's security forces were unaccountably massacring people, which did not happen. The Libya Islamic Fighting Group, the organization of the rebels who opposed Gaddafi, was closely associated with Al Qaeda, and Al Qaeda was created as a Gladio operation. Secretary Clinton and President Obama were well aware of this fact before they deployed bombers and troops to topple the Gaddafi government. Quote, there is a close link between Al Qaeda, jihadist organizations, and the opposition in Libya. Indeed, the Navy SEALs, disguised as Muslim garbs, were embedded in the rebels to launch the attacks against Libya government buildings, including Gaddafi's compound in Tripoli. Libya was the most prosperous country in Africa. Well, that would make you a target. Education, medical treatment, and electric were free for everybody in Libya. Gas sold for 42 cents a gallon. Well, you know that can't be allowed. Women who gave birth were supported with cash grants. Couples who were married was given a cash gift. Sounds like Hungary. He probably better be making sure he has a good security team. Libya's state bank provided loans without interest and provided startup capital to farmers. So basically, let's get this straight. Libya is the liberal utopia that they say they want. They have everything. They're educating women. Well, they probably don't have homosexuals, but they have everything but that. So they're doing everything the Democrats want to do. They're giving people money. They're giving free electricity. All their Medicare's free. Education's free. So it does sound like it's a leftist utopia, right? So why would they destroy it? Why would they bomb it out of existence? Gaddafi's independence from big oil and the money cartel was the cause of his demise. Gaddafi's goal was to organize Arabs in a bloc that could withstand Western demands. He wanted to create a pan-Africanism and refused to join U.S. Africa Command. So just so that y'all know, EUCOM was the military command that took up Europe and the continent of Africa. And they also had Israel in it because CENTCOM had all of the Middle East minus Israel because they don't put the conflicting like war zones under the same COCOM. And so when they created, they eventually split EUCOM into AFRICOM and EUCOM. And EUCOM was going to keep Europe, and AFRICOM was going to be a separate 4-star general and be in charge of AFRICOM. Well, Gaddafi said, I'm not participating in that. I'm not doing mill-to-mill exchanges with you. You're not going to have anybody here. Go pound sand. So he's a bad boy. Worse yet, Gaddafi attempted to create a gold-based African currency that would free Africans from the global banking system. Gaddafi used Chinese energy companies to develop their energy resources, and that again was a no-no. The power elite, already upset with Russia's presence in the Mediterranean, became faced with a Chinese presence too, thanks to Gaddafi. So he had to go. Then we get to ISIS, which the author contends was the creation of none other than Condoleezza Rice. The ISIS stands for Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. The former Chevron executive who served as Secretary of State under Bush Jr. called upon the Sunni states to form a Sunni belt in the Middle East in response to Iran's attempt to create a Shia belt. Responding to this summons, Prince Bandar bin Sultan, the Secretary General of Saudi, formed a group with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS to topple the Assad regime. The U.S. NATO military aid to this organization and ISIS was channeled covertly through America's closest allies, Qatar and Saudi Arabia. See the common denominator? Qatar. The two terror groups also received training in guerrilla warfare and religious indoctrination. As ranks began to grow, Saudi Arabia took the initiative and released prisoners that they had in their jails to join ISIS. Sound familiar with what Trump's telling us they're doing by emptying their jail cells and sending them all to America as refugees? The Saudi government even offered to pay stipends to the prisoners' family if they would go work for ISIS. So you have the CIA create ISIS, the CIA creates Al-Qaeda, and then you have Rice Bush working with Qatar and Saudi Arabia, with those two, to attack Iran and Syria. But we're told Syria and Iran are the bad guys. Wonder why that is. Gordon Duff, a senior editor of Veterans Today, alleges that ISIS terrorists were organized in Jordan and Syria by Senator John McCain, Major General Paul Valley, and some other military consultants. Valley is a Fox News military analyst and founder of the U.S. Psychological Warfare School. Shocker. Journalist Aaron Klein, who has unearthed evidence that ISIS forces were trained at secret military bases in Jordan. The report has been corroborated by Der Spiegel, Germany's leading newspaper, or magazine, sorry. Additional confirmation comes from Edward Snowden, the NSA whistleblower, who has produced classified government documents that show Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, is a CIA operative. That's exactly what happens when you have the strategy of tensions in Gladio. They create the terror, they unleash the terror, and then they reorchestrate or reorganize the country according to whatever they want. So then we have another foreign policy journalist, Colum Lynch, who writes, Israel is quietly cultivating ties with moderate Syria rebel groups operating around the country's UN-monitored ceasefire line with Syria, providing medical care and other identified supplies to the insurgents while potentially extracting valuable intel. In the past 3 months, battle-hardened Syrian rebels have transported scores of wounded Syrians across the ceasefire line to Israel for medical care. Once in Israel, they received medical treatment in a field clinic before being sent back to Syria, where presumably they will return to carry on the fight. The purpose of ISIS is to create an endless war that will serve to exhaust Saudi and Iranian military resources. And again, you say, oh, but they're working with Saudi, but only against Iran and Syria. They don't want them there either. So the purpose of ISIS is to pit all of them against each other to exhaust them. So they want to bring about the disillusionment of Syria because Syria is a big problem for them. You have one guy there, other than when they had Gaddafi, that is still standing that won't play with them. And that's Syria. I don't honestly see how that guy's still alive, but God bless him. They want the disillusionment of Syria and Iraq into smaller states that can be manipulated by the money cartel. And if you ever look at the map of what Israel thinks is really Israel's, it's basically all of Syria and a good chunk of Iraq. So that's the reason why we're at war with Iraq and Syria. It is on behalf of Israel because they want that territory. And if it's divided up into smaller chunks, it's easier for them to digest. This thesis is supported by classified CIA documents that confirm that the arms for ISIS came compliments of the CIA from an arsenal in Libya that they had stolen from Omar Gaddafi. The shipments of these weapons to ISIS in Syria was supervised in 2012 by David Petraeus, the CIA director, who would soon then resign because of alleged affair. That whole thing, if you guys go back, I mean, I know quite a bit about, yeah, you're funny. I'm getting bombed with the these bots, and you're right. I must be over the target. That's hilarious. We haven't had bots before. How about that? That's impressive. So the whole setup of David Petraeus is totally weird. I know more about that than I can actually say, but the whole thing is totally weird. So he's the CIA director, and he's too stupid to know that he can't have an affair with a biographer. There's way more to that story. So he knows, having been in CENTCOM, having been in Intel, he knows everything is bugged. He's not dumb. He found out something, he knew something. That whole affair exposure was done as a threat to keep him in line. When the U.S. military occupied, and I'm not saying he's a good guy because I personally don't think he is. I have a personal vendetta, if you will, of every military senior officer who did not resign in protest. When it came to Afghanistan, it was clear after about the first 3 years that the rules of engagement was getting people killed. Having came in right after Vietnam, we were told the exact same thing I was for 30 years. If the rules of engagement endangers the lives of unnecessarily, I mean, we're in a war, if they unnecessarily endanger the lives of military members, your recourse as a military officer is to resign in protest and tell it in the loudest voice you have what is going on and the setup. That was driven into my head for 21 years as an officer, 22 years as an officer. And not a single one of those idiots that came to any of my professional military education, which is, I mean, at Air War College, a lot of 4-stars come streaming through there up on stage telling, how great you're going to be as a senior officer, blah, blah, blah. And here's what you do. And here's my military challenges that I've had in my career and what I did to resolve them. And every single one of them is like, oh, yeah, you have to protect all your subordinates. That was a meat grinder over there. We killed just hundreds, thousands of our young, bright military members in a meat grinder, and not a freaking one of them resigned. Not a freaking one of them exposed it. I hate them all. I have no respect for any of them. And basically, they're all consultants in some, military industrial complex. They are the epitome of disgusting snakes. In the U.S. military occupation of Afghanistan. Okay, so now we got through with we're going to get to the Mexican cartels, because I'm going to tell you right now, the Mexican cartels work for the CIA. This is part of the Gladio operation. If you go from owning the entire drug apparatus And your mafia connections into the United States, as far as distributions, get whacked because of Giuliani and the exposure that happened in New York, what do? You look for a new network. We're going to bring them in a different way. We're not going to bring them in the ports. I mean, you got the Coast Guard, they're all kind of on to all of that stuff. So we're going to bring them across the border. Well, what do you need to do in order to bring drugs across the border? Well, you need crises throughout all of Latin America. I'm going to go in there and knock off all of the leaders. I'm going to confiscate all of their shit. I'm going to make conditions so bad with dictators, they all want to leave. I've got this run to the border, and I'm going to use these people as cattle. I'm going to use the chaos of the border, which all of those son of a bitches would not close until Trump, because they're all in on it. They were trafficking all of the drugs across the border. Open daylight, didn't give a crap. People dead, they don't give a crap. And that was their new thing. So if you think that I'm stupid enough to believe that they control the entire drug thing for the world, and they're making trillions of dollars every year controlling the entire thing, and then all of a sudden, because Rudy Giuliani arrests a few of the mafia families and they have to cut off those ports, that all of a sudden this rogue batch of hoodlums in Mexico stands up and goes, oh, look, I got an AK-47, and I don't care that you've got this gigantic intel apparatus and you control everything in the world. I'm going to take control of your border, and I'm going to take control of the entire worldwide drug operation. Bullshit. That did not happen. That's crap. What happened was that somebody went to Mexico and says, I want you, and I want you, and y'all are going to be the new cartel leaders in Mexico. Just like, let me just give you this analogy. After World War II, we made up a bunch of countries, okay? There was no Pakistan. Well, guess what? There's a Pakistan. There wasn't Saudi Arabia as we know it. There wasn't Jordan as we know it. Jordan's a completely made up country, and it has a king. If you think these people can make kings and they can't control the drug operation, please go somewhere else. That ain't what's happening. The Mexican cartels are just Gladio 2. So the military occupation of Afghanistan became precarious. The CIA worked with Mexican drug cartels to develop poppy fields in Mexico. By 2013, heroin and cocaine was being grown in Mexico with a street value of $3 billion, and it began flooding into, primarily at that time, Chicago. It came via rail, air, land, including 747 jetliners. And let me just also point out something else that a brilliant person said on My True Social. They live in Michigan. They watch the only train that comes from Mexico that is allowed to cross a border without inspection is car factory trains, bringing cars to Michigan, which is remarkably close to Chicago, where drugs are. So if you've got all of the Midwest car manufacturing, not the companies, the manufacturing going south of the border, and you make a deal with Mexico and Homeland Security that your train is not going to get inspected, guess where they're going to bring the drugs in? They're going to put them in those cars. And guess where they have found drugs? In those cars. And yet they still have not changed that policy. So we've got an open avenue. So we've got all this chaos, again, chaos, control. We've got all this chaos going on our border. And meanwhile, they're tracking trainload after trainload after trainload of drugs right up to Midwest. And so as soon as she said that, the very first thing I thought of was, and pardon me if it wasn't a she, I'm pretty sure it was a she. The first thing I thought of was, is that what Trump was doing when he told Ford, oh, hell no, you're not building your factory in Mexico because I'm on to you? Wouldn't that just be the thing? Because that's what he does. He knows all of the shit. He knows exactly what they're doing. And without us even knowing at the time, what he was doing was poking them in the eye. I know you're freaking bringing drugs in, and you're using the excuse of factories in Mexico to do it. Screw you. You ain't building your factory down there. But of course, Biden lets them. Yes, it's about cars. I'm telling you. So, back to the book. We're almost done. The when Jesus Vicente Zambada Nebla, why can't these people have normal names? A member of the Sinaloa cartel was collared in Chicago police officials by Chicago police officials. He claimed that he was a CIA operative under government protection. His trial was halted by federal prosecutors on the basis of Classified Information Procedures Act, and it said any further prosecution of him would be a threat to national security. So we started out tonight telling you that embedding the illegal Gladio operation into the CIA was to protect it and put that label of national security on it. And you see it right there. By 2018, Mexico's southwestern state became a top source of heroin for the U.S. drug epidemic. 64,000 deaths in 2016 alone from heroin. The DEA says that 93% of the heroin in America now comes from Mexico, double the amount from 5 years ago. That particular location in the South where it's grown is because of the mountainous area and its inaccessibility, which of course is exactly what drew them to the Golden Triangle in northern Afghanistan. The Sinaloa cartel controls the flow. They have only one rival, something Jalisco New Generation cartel, which arose from infighting after the arrest of El Chapo. The strength of the Sinaloas stems from the support in the form of arms and immunity that the cartel has received from the CIA. Oh, imagine that. Two reporters for the Washington Times quote, the CIA's motive is clear. The U.S. government is afraid that the Los Zetas cartel will mount a successful coup against the government of Felipe Calderon, unquote. So, yeah, we're just going to get in bed with the cartels because we don't want them to take out our favorite president. But the motive isn't clear since the CIA purportedly has controlled and abetted Los Zetas by approving military training for members of this criminal syndicate at Fort Bragg and other military installations throughout the U.S. So did you know that we were training the cartels in America? It's clear that this Gladio's strategy of tension is at work on the southern border. The new poppy fields to be cultivated to perpetuate the CIA's covert operations. The operations that will safeguard not the American people, but rather the holdings of the bankers and the businessmen. And then the author is kind of winding down here and giving a general overview. And he basically makes the statement that Gladio began as a covert operation to thwart the spread of communism. It never was to do that. That's the excuse they used. There was no way that this was used to thwart communism because the same people that created Nazism created communism, created XYZ. Every bad thing, they're behind all of it. So that was the excuse because, again, as we described at the very beginning, you have communism that's supposedly on the left and Nazism that's supposedly on the right, and they hurt us down the middle. They use these two extremes to be the impetus for the cattle prods to keep poking so they can shoot us all through the um, onto the railroad train tracks to our death. So that basically is the rest of the book. And wow, what an amazing, enlightening journey that was. I'm going to have a separate, there's this book here. We're not going to go through this book like we did this one. I do want to highlight a couple of things in this one. The Gladio units, because this is basically what this is. This is called NATO Secret Army by Danielle Ganser. I don't recommend buying the book. This book is very dry, and it goes country by country. I mean, obviously you can buy it if you want, but you can see this is me doing my books. I'm one of those nasty people that write all over it. Julie kept saying, "Oh, that wasn't me that wrote on it," and I'm laughing the whole time she's saying that because I'm like, I write all over all of mine. I'm sure my kids will throw these all in the trash when I die anyway. But anyway, I make myself notes so that I can either later write about them without having to read the whole thing again. But I also do research in them. But there's two countries that I think stand out as far as illustrating the depth of depravity of these people. And one of them is Greece. Greece is a very interesting, and again, because I lived over there, I visited Greece. I had no idea. But you're going to see things that we've saw in our lifetime, like the financial crisis that happened in Greece. Was bore out of activities relating to Gladio. So much of what we have seen on the peripheral and just didn't make any sense at all. You find out, and everything that we were told about it was a lie. So I do want to, and I don't know when I'm going to get to that, but that's definitely, we're going to be leaving here from my mobile command post on Wednesday morning, and we will be traveling Wednesday and Thursday. So I'm not sure I'll get any time to do that. And I might be able to get one done tomorrow during the day, because I do know that's helpful for some of the people that don't live in the US if we do a daytime one, because my daughter will be at work and then she's taken off Tuesday, so I won't be able to do one then. So I do want to kind of wrap this up with a couple of real life illustrations. We've pretty much in this book went through, other than Italy, which obviously was kind of the most in-depth investigated, Gladio. Now that you've got the concept, you understand who monetarily is behind the whole string pulling thing. I think it'd be very interesting to look at a couple and what it meant to the people and how they did it. And probably of all of these, and I mean, they have all of the European countries in here. I think Portugal and Greece are probably two of the best ones that's in here. And instead of reading a bunch of it, I'm just going to do like a summary and kind of tell you what they did. And I'll do that in a separate broadcast. I'll label it NATO Secret Army, abbreviated book review, if you will, so that you'll be able to recognize it. So let me grab my glasses, and I want to read your comments. Many things on those trains. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So if you don't understand, let me just talk about that for a minute. So if you were to go and look at a map of what the world looked like in 1900. Then look at a map in 1920, and then look at a map in 1950. They literally created countries out of whole cloth. So you will see, here's India, and here's, you've got China over here, you've got India, you've got Afghanistan. Pakistan didn't even exist. There was no such thing as a Pakistan. What they did after World War II is they created countries, like took part of Afghanistan and part of India. And in doing so, they broke up their, on purpose. They broke up, like, here's and they lived in tribes. Okay. So here's the territorial of this tribe. And then there will be another one up here and another one. They made a line down the middle of them. So you've got people who are related that live on this side and people that are related that live on this side. So they don't necessarily like each other. And now you have the countries involved as far as governments, and eventually in Pakistan and India's case with nuclear weapons. So they on purpose created strife by drawing the line where they did, purposely breaking up territory, and creating fractions. So if you go back to the Middle East, where you have, here's Iraq, here's Iran. The top are Kurdish. So instead of, and here's Afghanistan or Turkey up here, that's Kurdish. Here's Syria over here, that part's Kurdish. So instead of drawing a circle and saying, Kurds, here's your country, they didn't do that. And Turkey doesn't like Kurds. The Syrians don't like them. Iraq doesn't like them. Iran doesn't like them. So you have strife inside of every single one of those countries. Well, then what's the CIA do? They go and arm the Kurds. And so now you have entire countries with indigenous anti-whatever people. You get the Gladio units in Turkey who are now attacking the Kurds and the PKK by labeling them communists, and they were not. And so instead of creating countries that with like cultures, they purposely drew lines and created countries with internal strife. Part of Gladio, strategy of tension. It all goes together. So after World War I, when they came up with the the League of Nations, originally Britain was given stewardship over the piece of property that was going to be the homeland for the Jews. And it was a huge chunk of territory to include all of current Jordan. At the time, it was called Transjordan. And all of what is in Israel, a huge chunk of land. But the majority of the people that lived there were Muslim. Well, we know that they have India over here as a colony. And guess what's between UK and India? On their road, a whole bunch of Muslims. So what the UK did is every time they got attacked here, they gave a little bit of property up here. So eventually, all of Jordan is created between World War I and World War II and not given to what was going to be the Jewish homeland. So you have an entire country made out of whole cloth. They didn't have a royal family. They didn't have jack crap. Oh, let's appoint a king. And the whole thing about the House Assad, same thing. There was all kinds of contentious efforts about Saudi Arabia, the creation of Qatar, and all of these supposedly royal families. Go back and read your history. It's all made up bullshit. All right, what else we got? Yeah, turn family against family. That's exactly right. So these are kind of our takeaways from this book. Strategy of tension, stay behind units. Anytime you hear that, or a terror cell, every time you hear those words, the very first thing you need to think from now on is Gladio. And while this particular author, Paul Williams, lays all of it on the CIA, it is not all the CIA. We started that way and I want to end that way. It is not all the CIA. The Mossad is a mirror image of CIA. They work together. MI5 and MI6, a mirror image. And keep in mind the German intel, which we never hear about, which makes you wonder. Well, it doesn't make me wonder. Any of them that you don't hear about, you need to be very concerned about. So we don't ever hear about the BND, which it stands for a long German name, but that's their intel that was set up by General Reinhard Gehlen, who is the Nazi guy that created the Gladio units initially called werewolf units. And so he created the stay behind units, and he made a deal for his freedom by giving the details of them to Alan Dulles. And the BND was intricately involved in all of the stay behind terror creating activities throughout Europe. They are the original authors of the network. So don't think for a minute that they are not involved in this, because they absolutely are. And so anyway, a lot of those, Antifa, BLM, absolutely. All of those. You can map Antifa right over, because the epiphany for me the other day was that the right sector and Azov Nazi battalions are part of the stay behind unit. They were part of the because Ukraine at the time, Poland, all occupied by Germany. Those organizations was part of the original setup by Gehlen. And Antifa, there has been article after article written that many of those people, to include BLM activists, were trained in Ukraine. We just read that McCain was involved in the setup, Condoleezza Rice, of parts of ISIS, Al-Qaeda. There are so many pictures of Ukraine in McCain in Ukraine, along with Lindsey Graham. So they are all involved. All right, what else we got? Okay, so we're going to call it a night. We're going to post the links in the comments section to the footnotes. Again, Julie does a really good job of digging into some of those and highlighting some of the important ones, which I'm eternally grateful to. And we'll get them posted as soon as we're done. And I will, excuse me, hopefully talk to y'all sometime tomorrow morning on the overview of Greece and Portugal, kind of just giving you a 15-minute summary of both of them to illustrate, because what's important about them is to show you how they operate. So when you start hearing certain things, they need to immediately click off in your brain. So thanks for being here tonight. I will see you tomorrow, hopefully.